As I mentioned,
Yes. Yeah, I think you need to. Okay, that's working. As I mentioned earlier, the evening sessions to slowly present the overall framework within which this Shamatha practice is based. So I'd like to do that, of course, over each evening, sort of build up the framework. So this evening I'd like to start by looking at the history of Buddhism, when it began, how it spread, the different classes or systems of teachings that the Buddha taught, and how they are the basis for the various modern day traditions. Not working? No. It's sort of...
Maybe it's a bit loud. It's looking...
Is that working? No. Working. No. Is that better? Is that working now? Working. Okay. Is that better? Okay, let's see if that works. So what I'd like to do this evening is present the history of Buddhism, when it began and how it spread, so we can begin to look at the framework for the various Buddhist traditions. So, of course, it all began 563 BC in a place which is called Lumbini now, which is actually part of modern-day Nepal. A prince was born, Prince Siddhartha. He was the son of the king of that whole region. And when he was born, the wise man of the court prophesied to the king that this child would either be a great king himself or a great spiritual leader. So of course he wanted his son to follow in his footsteps to become the next king. So then he did everything possible in the child's upbringing to head him in this direction. So he surrounded him with all the pleasures in the palace and everything, and trained him to become the next king. But then as the prince was growing up, he a few times managed to go outside of the palace to see what was going on outside the palace, and there of course he saw a lot of sickness, aging and death. And also on one occasion when he went out, he saw a wandering ascetic who seemed to be very much at peace with himself. So all of these experiences got the prince thinking about the meaning of life and how, if it's possible to overcome suffering. So then he decided he needed to pursue this to find out the meaning of life and if he can overcome suffering. So at age 29 he escaped from the palace. He went out in the search of the truth. And already at that time, of course, there were a number of spiritual traditions in India. And some of those traditions, of course, also had the idea that you could be liberated from suffering. And a lot of them felt that the way to be liberated from suffering was simply developing higher and higher levels of concentration, samadhi. And so Prince Siddhartha was following some of these teachers, developing very high levels of samadhi, and because it was felt that the source of suffering was craving, attachment. So by developing higher levels of samadhi, it was felt we could go beyond craving and attachment. In particular, craving and attachment for the body. So one of the main practices there as well were ascetic practices, denying the body, not feeding the body, to try and overcome craving for the body. So Prince followed these practices for 6 years, and not feeding, starving the body, and he was on the point of death when he realized that this was simply another extreme. That previously, earlier in his life, he was in the extreme of indulgence in the palace, and now he had simply gone to the other extreme of asceticism, of denial. And so he abandoned his teacher, took some food, and set out in search of the truth himself. And what happened next, I'd like to read from another book, the account from What Makes You Not a Buddhist by Songsar Khyentse. I think he puts it very nicely, so I'll read from his book here on page 33. He says, "Through many years of contemplation and penance, Siddhartha remained steadfast in his determination to find the root cause of suffering and to ease his own suffering and the suffering of others. He headed to Magadha in the heart of India to continue his meditation. Along the way he met a grass seller named Satya, who offered him a handful of kusha grass. Siddhartha recognized this as an auspicious sign. In ancient Indian culture, kusha grass was considered a cleansing substance. Instead of continuing his journey, he decided to stop and meditate right there. He found a place to sit on the flat stones under a nearby Ficus religiosa tree, using the kusha grass as a mat. Silently he vowed, this body may rot, I may disintegrate into the dust, but until I find the answer, I will not rise. As Siddhartha sat in contemplation beneath the tree, he did not go unnoticed. Mara, the king of the demons, heard Siddhartha's vow and sensed the strength of his resolve. Mara grew sleepless, for he knew that within Siddhartha existed the potential to throw his entire domain into chaos. Being a strategic warrior, he sent 5 of his most beautiful daughters to distract and seduce the prince. As the girls set out, they had full confidence in their seductive talents. But as they approached the meditating Siddhartha, their beauty began to vanish. They withered and aged, they grew warts, and a stench rose from their skin. Siddhartha did not stir. The dejected Apsaras returned to their father, who was furious. How dare anyone refuse his daughters? In his rage, Mara summoned his retinue, a great army furnished with every imaginable weapon. Mara's army attacked in full force, but to their dismay, all the arrows, spears, stones and catapults aimed at Siddhartha transformed into a rain of flowers as soon as they came within reach of their target. After many long hours of unsuccessful warfare, Mara and his army were exhausted and defeated. Finally, Mara came to Siddhartha and with all his diplomacy tried to talk him into giving up his quest. Siddhartha said he could not give up after all these lifetimes of trying. Mara asked, "How can we be so sure you have been struggling for so long?" Siddhartha answered, "I don't need validation. The earth is my witness." With this he touched the ground, the earth shook, and Mara evaporated into thin air. Thus Siddhartha found liberation and became a Buddha. He had discovered the path to end suffering at its very root, not only for himself but for all people. The place of his final battle against Mara is now called Bodh Gaya, and the tree under which he sat is called the Bodhi tree. This is a story that Buddhist mothers have told their children for many generations. So when we look at that story, of course we can accept it literally, that there was a Mara, there was daughters, and there was an army. But actually, if we understand that story well, we can understand that the Mara, the daughters, and the army are symbolic of three inner demons that Siddhartha overcame. And these three inner demons are these three poisons which I've briefly mentioned already. That the three poisons are ignorance, attachment, and aversion. So ignorance, of course, is symbolized by Mara himself, the demon. His daughters symbolize attachment, and the army are symbolizing aversion. So ignorance here, of course, in Sanskrit is avidya. Vidya means to know. A is negation, so not knowing. But ignorance here is more than not knowing reality, it's actively misunderstanding reality. And then due to that, this leads to attachment and aversion. Attachment to pleasant things, aversion to unpleasant things. We looked at attachment today, briefly this afternoon, and tomorrow afternoon we'll be looking at aversion. So these are the three poisons symbolized by Mara, the daughters, and the army in the story here. So then Siddhartha found liberation from suffering and became Buddha. So when Prince Siddhartha became Buddha, he became known as Shakyamuni Buddha. So Buddha means someone who's completely awakened. In other words, someone who's not only overcome all suffering and its causes and all mental afflictions, but someone who's fully developed all the positive qualities as well. Shakyamuni we can divide into two. Shakya was the clan or of people that Prince Siddhartha grew up with, and Muni means courage or strength or capability. So Shakyamuni Buddha is the fully awakened one from the Shakya clan who has a lot of capacity or ability to help liberate others from suffering. And Shakyamuni Buddha then went on to teach what he had discovered, to help others. And we can divide up his various teachings into what's called the three turnings of the wheel. The very first teaching he gave after achieving enlightenment was the Four Noble Truths. And he taught this in a place called Sarna. Very close to Varanasi. And the Four Noble Truths are the foundation of all Buddhist traditions. And this is going to be the topic for tomorrow evening. But essentially in the Four Noble Truths, the Buddha was being like our doctor, describing what is our current condition, why are we stuck in this state of suffering, the fact that we can cure ourselves, we can achieve liberation from this state of suffering, and then the medicine, how to do that. So these are the Four Noble Truths, and we'll be looking at that tomorrow evening in a lot more detail. And in the Four Noble Truths, he taught that the fundamental ignorance, our distorted view of reality, that is the root of all of our suffering, was grasping to self. That we overinflate sense of me, and we're grasping on to what's called self. And we'll look at that also in more detail tomorrow evening. So what he taught actually in the Four Noble Truths was how we see the world is not a problem. There is an objective world out there. That it's only how we see ourselves as a person that is a problem. So what we can say then in the Four Noble Truths teachings is that we are to realize that there's no self and that actually everything is real. There is an independent me, there is an independent world there. No problems. Then in the what's called the second turning of the wheel teachings, he taught the perfection of wisdom teachings. And he taught this in a place called Rajgir. And in this teachings, he went further. He built on the Four Noble Truths. He said, actually, how we see the world is also a problem. Not just how we see ourselves as a person. There is no independent world, independent me. So here, effectively in these teachings, he said, nothing is real. In the sense that nothing exists independently. Here he said everything exists independently. Here he said nothing exists independently. And these perfection of wisdom teachings, when we hear this, it's very easy to misunderstand this, because this seems to imply that nothing really exists at all. So it's very easy here to fall into the extreme of nihilism, thinking that therefore nothing exists. To help overcome that, we have the third turning of the wheel. Often called fine distinction, mainly taught in an area around Vaishali. And here he taught some things are real. Because here in the Four Noble Truths, he said, everything's real. There is an independent me, there's an independent objective world, no problem. The problem is that we just overinflate the sense of me, we grasp onto self. So that's what we need to get rid of. That's the ignorance we need to eliminate, this grasping to self. But here he went on to say, nothing is real, meaning there's no independent me, no independent world at all. And again, it's because there's no independent world, because the world is a product of our mind. And therefore, to avoid misunderstanding this, meaning that therefore nothing exists at all, he said some things are real. Meaning, okay, there is no independent objective world. The world is a product of our mind, but because everything's coming from the mind is real, because that's the source of everything. So that's what he taught here in the third turning of the wheel. So, based on these three systems of teachings, we have 4 philosophical systems evolving in ancient India. So from the Four Noble Truths, we have 2 philosophical systems evolving in India called Vaibhashika and Sautrantika. From the Perfection of Wisdom teachings, we have a philosophical system called Madhyamika forming. And from the third turning of the wheel, the philosophical system we have evolving in ancient India is called Chitta Matra. And we'll look at these 4 philosophical systems again. That'll be one of the topics for one of the later evenings in this retreat. I just wanted to mention it here, so we'll have a look at a little bit more detail what they really mean later. Now, no, maybe I'll leave it there. We'll cover that later. Okay, so these are the 3 sort of what's called the turnings of the wheel, 3 different systems of teaching that the Buddha taught, because he taught according to people's capacity. And these were the philosophical systems that evolved from those. And he taught over a period of 45 years. And then at age 80, he passed into what's called parinirvana. And there are different assertions about what happened when his body finished at the end of his life, and we'll maybe touch on that a little bit later in this retreat, one of the later evenings. Any questions about any of this before I move on?
Is there a tradition teaching all of those learnings?
Okay. So the question is there any traditions teaching all of those? What we're going to shortly see, and we'll expand on this actually a bit more later in one of the later evenings in this retreat, is that these are building on each other, and so we can look at them as sort of levels of teaching. So, for example, when Buddhism... the most common teaching, the teaching that was most widely taught was, of course, the Four Noble Truths. So this was the teaching, systems of teachings that initially widely spread in India, and then started to spread from India into Sri Lanka, and then up through Southeast Asia, into Myanmar, Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, down through Southeast Asia. And when these systems of teachings were being transmitted to these countries, it was transmitted through the Pali language. And so these traditions collectively now are called the Theravada Buddhist traditions. And so the Theravada Buddhist traditions are basing their teachings on the Four Noble Truths. And the Four Noble Truths, the goal of the spiritual path is nirvana, to achieve personal liberation from suffering. So in the Theravada traditions, we are striving for this goal of nirvana. And again, we'll look at that in more detail later in the retreat. These ideas here were not so widely taught, and they only started to spread in India a little bit later. And then, at that time when Buddhism spread, it spread through the Sanskrit language. And so then Buddhism spread up across the Himalayas onto the Silk Route, and it spread across into China, Korea, Japan, and down to Vietnam. And then at a later time it spread over the Himalayas again into Tibet. So all of these Buddhist traditions, when they go back to the original text, they go back to the text written in Sanskrit. And those traditions collectively now are called the Mahayana Buddhist traditions. And they are typically, whereas the Pali traditions are typically based on the Four Noble Truths, the Sanskrit Mahayana traditions are really based on this perfection of wisdom teachings. And in these perfection of wisdom teachings, not only are we saying here that nothing is real, but also in these teachings we talk about the further goal of enlightenment. So in these teachings, also in the third wheel of course, the final goal of spiritual path is enlightenment. So in the Mahayana traditions, then we are striving for this goal of enlightenment. What the differences are between these two, again, we'll talk about in a little bit more detail later. But very briefly, nirvana is the goal of personal liberation from suffering. The goal of enlightenment is also liberating ourselves from suffering, but to put ourselves in a state where we can effectively help liberate everyone else from suffering as well. So enlightenment is a further goal than nirvana, and we'll have a look at the more detailed differences later in this retreat. Any more questions? Yeah.
If I remember correctly, in the last retreat, you taught the third one as a Buddha nature.
Right. So this third turning of the wheel has two parts to it. The one I'm mentioning here is in terms of the view of reality, in terms of everything real, nothing real, some things are real. The other part to the third turning of the wheel is teachings on Buddha nature. So there are two parts to this third turning of the wheel. This teaching here formed the basis of what's called the Chittamatra philosophical system.